In the 1950s, medicine believed it had finally entered its golden age. Chemistry had conquered pain, silenced infections, and promised control over the body itself. But a new drug appeared in this atmosphere of absolute confidence, introduced as modern, gentle, almost miraculous. It was described as safe, advanced, nearly free of side effects, a symbol of how far science had come. For pregnant women suffering from something as ordinary and harmless as morning sickness, it seemed like a blessing. A woman would walk into a clinic nauseated, exhausted, anxious about her pregnancy, and walk out with a simple prescription, reassured by calm voices and white coats that everything was under control. Months later, the illusion collapsed. A child was born without arms or with limbs so short and malformed they looked as if they had been cut away before life even began. In other delivery rooms, babies arrived with missing legs, twisted hands, or bodies that did not resemble anything their parents had imagined. Doctors stood frozen, staring at what they had never been trained to explain. Parents moved from joy to horror in a single breath. There was no infection to blame, no accident during birth, no visible mistake. The mothers were healthy. The pregnancy seemed normal. The questions multiplied faster than the answers, and silence filled the space where explanations should have been. What no one wanted to consider, at least at first, was the unthinkable possibility that the damage had not come from a disease, or from fate, or from some cruel twist of nature, but from trust itself. From the small, ordinary pill taken without fear, from the routine prescription written with confidence, from the belief that modern medicine could not possibly be wrong. The most devastating truth would emerge slowly and painfully. The force that destroyed these children had not been an illness attacking from the outside, but a medical promise delivered in good faith. It was not the body that betrayed them. It was the cure. The drug at the center of this disaster was called thalidomide. It was developed in West Germany by a pharmaceutical company named Grunenthal, at a time when speed and confidence mattered more than caution. From the moment it was introduced, thalidomide was presented as a breakthrough, not as a risk. It was marketed as a mild sedative, something gentle enough to calm anxiety, help with sleep, and, most importantly, ease the nausea that plagued many pregnant women. In an era desperate for simple chemical solutions, this promise was irresistible. Advertisements spoke in absolute terms. Thalidomide was described as completely safe, modern, and harmless, a drug so gentle that it could supposedly be taken without fear. Some campaigns went even further, suggesting that it was safe enough for children, a statement that today sounds almost unthinkable. In several countries, the drug did not even require a prescription. It sat on pharmacy shelves as if it were no more dangerous than a headache pill, quietly entering millions of homes with no warning attached. What made this possible was not just corporate confidence, but a massive regulatory blind spot. At the time, there were no real laws requiring drugs to be tested on pregnant women or evaluated for their effects on developing embryos. If a medication did not immediately poison the adult taking it, it was often assumed to be safe. The womb was treated as a protected space by default, as if the placenta itself were a perfect shield against harm. Thalidomide passed every shallow test placed in front of it, not because it was harmless, but because no one had thought to ask the most important question. The drug did not make mothers sick. It did not cause sudden deaths or dramatic reactions. It worked exactly as promised on the surface, calming nerves and settling stomachs. That apparent safety was its greatest deception. While doctors and patients saw only relief,
Thalidomide was crossing into the developing fetus and interfering with the most delicate stages of human growth. And because no system existed to look for that kind of damage, the drug spread across continents before anyone realized that a silent catastrophe was unfolding.
Doctors trusted thalidomide because, by the standards of that era, it appeared almost perfectly clean. There were no reports of sudden deaths, no dramatic poisonings, no patients collapsing after taking it. Mothers did not flood hospitals with side effects, and emergency rooms were not seeing anything that raised alarms. To physicians trained to look for immediate and visible harm, this absence of danger felt like proof of safety. In their daily practice, the drug did exactly what it promised and nothing more, calming nausea and anxiety without leaving a trail of obvious damage behind. What made the trust even stronger was the nature of the harm itself. Thalidomide did not attack the mother's organs, did not disrupt her blood pressure, and did not trigger acute toxicity. It worked quietly, invisibly, crossing into the womb where no doctor could see and no patient could feel what was happening. The mother felt fine, reassured by her own well-being, while the damage unfolded in complete silence inside the developing fetus. Medicine at the time had no tools, no routine screenings, and no conceptual framework to suspect a drug that spared the adult but destroyed the unborn. Pharmaceutical companies reinforced this illusion with confidence and authority. They declared the drug safe, backed their claims with limited internal data, and wrapped their assurances in the language of science and progress. Doctors, raised in a culture where pharmaceutical innovation was synonymous with advancement, accepted these claims as fact. Questioning them was not yet a habit. Skepticism had not been institutionalized. Trust flowed downward from companies to regulators, from regulators to doctors, and from doctors to patients. The fatal mistake was simple and devastating. Thalidomide was never tested for its effects on a developing embryo. No one had asked what it might do during the earliest days of pregnancy, when organs are forming and the blueprint of the body is being written. That single missing question turned trust into tragedy. The drug did not fail because it was unpredictable, but because medicine had failed to imagine that safety for the mother did not automatically mean safety for the child.
At first, it looked like a cruel coincidence, the kind of statistical anomaly medicine occasionally whispers about and then quietly forgets. Doctors in different cities, then different countries, began noticing the same impossible sight. Babies born without arms, without legs, or with limbs so short they resembled unfinished thoughts rather than human anatomy. Some had fingers growing directly from their shoulders, others had feet attached close to the hips, and many carried additional injuries hidden beneath the skin, malformed hearts that struggled to beat, eyes that never fully formed, ears that could not hear the world they had entered. Each case, taken alone, could be dismissed, a rare defect, a tragic roll of the genetic dice. But the cases kept coming, and they did not stay confined to one hospital or one region. Germany saw them, Britain saw them, Australia, Japan, and parts of Europe followed. Pediatric wards filled with the same unanswered question, asked in hushed voices over incubators. Why now? Early explanations reached for anything familiar. Perhaps it was a genetic mutation spreading silently through families. Perhaps pollution from factories was poisoning the air, the water, the soil itself. Some whispered about radiation, still a fresh fear in a world living under the shadow of nuclear weapons. Newspapers flirted with darker language, calling it a curse of the modern industrial age, as if progress itself had turned against its children.
What no one wanted to consider was the simplest and most uncomfortable possibility. These mothers had done nothing reckless. They had followed medical advice. They had trusted their doctors. And doctors, in turn, had trusted something sitting quietly on their shelves, wrapped in clean packaging, approved by authority, prescribed with confidence. The idea that a routine medication, something given to ease nausea, to bring comfort, was almost unthinkable. So for a while, the drug remained invisible, hiding in plain sight, while the numbers rose and the pattern slowly, painfully began to sharpen. Eventually, a few doctors began to feel that quiet unease that precedes every medical reckoning. It was not proof yet, just a sense that chance alone could no longer explain what they were seeing. In Australia, an obstetrician named William McBride started reviewing his cases more carefully than usual. He noticed that many of the mothers who had given birth to severely malformed babies shared an eerily ordinary detail in their medical histories. They had been prescribed the same medication early in pregnancy, often casually, often without a second thought. Around the same time in Germany, a pediatrician and geneticist named Wedekind Lenz was doing something similar, tracing cases backward, asking uncomfortable questions, comparing notes that others had overlooked. Separately, unknowingly, they were circling the same conclusion. As their observations deepened, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Nearly every affected mother had taken thalidomide, not later in pregnancy, not randomly, but within a narrow and terrifying window, the first 40 days after conception, when the embryo is quietly building the blueprint of the human body. If the drug was taken outside that window, the baby was often born unharmed. Inside it, the damage was precise, ruthless, and irreversible. Arms failed to grow, legs never formed. Organs that should have developed in careful sequence simply did not. And yet the mothers themselves felt nothing, no pain, no warning, no sign that anything was wrong. They went about their lives believing everything was normal, while inside the womb, development was being dismantled piece by piece. That was the most horrifying part of the discovery. This was not a poison that made women violently ill or caused immediate tragedy. It was a silent saboteur. The mother remained healthy, reassured by the absence of side effects, while the fetus paid the entire price. When McBride and Lenz finally spoke out, their warnings landed like thunder in a medical world that had grown too comfortable with trust. The realization was chilling in its simplicity. A drug praised for its safety was capable of destroying a human life without ever harming the person who swallowed it. And once that truth surfaced, it became clear that the tragedy unfolding across continents was not random at all. It had a cause, a name, and a timeline. And the world was about to learn just how catastrophic blind faith in medicine could become. The mechanism was deceptively simple, yet devastating in its precision. Thalidomide interfered with angiogenesis, the process by which new blood vessels form. In a developing embryo, every organ, every limb, every finger and toe depends on a precise supply of blood at exactly the right time. When thalidomide disrupted that flow, certain areas simply failed to receive the nutrients and oxygen they needed to grow. Arms, legs, ears, eyes, even parts of the heart might never form or would stop growing halfway, leaving grotesque, incomplete structures. Yet the brain, protected by its unique vascular system, often remained intact. Consciousness, awareness, and the capacity to perceive the world persisted in a body that could not fully respond or interact. It was a cruel paradox. Inside a womb, life thrived in some systems while being annihilated in others. Mothers, unaware, went about their daily lives thinking everything was normal. They experienced no sickness, no warning signs, no pain, and yet inside them, a meticulously timed disaster unfolded. A tiny human being, aware, listening to the muffled rhythm of the mother's heart, could feel nothing about the absence of limbs that should have existed, could sense nothing about the incompleteness that would define their first breaths. And when these children were born, the shock was immediate, public, and devastating. Families confronted the impossible reality of living with a body that did not match the mind within, of trying to raise children who were, in every sense, both present and tragically absent in parts. The silent horror of thalidomide was not in the speed of death. It was in the slow, unseen sabotage of creation itself, leaving intact minds trapped in incomplete, fragile vessels, forever bearing the mark of a society that had trusted too easily, that had assumed safe meant harmless, that had believed progress and modernity could not contain catastrophe. The scale of the tragedy was almost unimaginable at the time, and even today the numbers evoke a profound sense of shock. Over 10,000 babies entered the world with severe malformations, limbs reduced to stumps or entirely absent, faces altered, hearts malformed, ears missing or misplaced, eyes misaligned, and every single life forever changed. But the official statistics only tell part of the story. Behind those numbers were tens of thousands of miscarriages, pregnancies lost quietly, uncounted, their potential snuffed out silently, victims of a drug that acted with invisible precision. Germany, the epicenter of thalidomide's development and distribution, bore the brunt of the disaster, but no corner of the globe was untouched. Britain faced an overwhelming wave of affected children. Japan's hospitals struggled to cope with the influx. Australia and Canada recorded shocking clusters of deformities, each case a stark reminder that modern medicine, when unchecked, could betray the very people it was meant to protect. Some of these children survived into adulthood, learning to navigate a world that was not built for their bodies, adapting in extraordinary ways, finding ways to live and thrive despite the physical limitations imposed upon them. Others, however, did not survive even a single week, leaving parents in unbearable grief, families haunted by the cruel knowledge that the promise of medicine had been twisted into a mechanism of harm. The disaster was not simply a medical failure, it was a social, ethical, and emotional catastrophe, a wound that extended far beyond the laboratory or pharmacy, into homes, schools, and communities, shaping generations with its invisible but indelible mark. Each number in the statistics represented a story, a struggle, a body that did not match the mind within, and the collective horror was amplified by the knowledge that it had all been preventable, had all been the result of blind trust in authority and a catastrophic failure of oversight. The lack of oversight was staggering, almost unimaginable by today's standards. There were no long-term studies to track the drug's effects over the crucial weeks of embryonic development. No mandatory testing on pregnant subjects, though ethical as well as practical concerns complicated such trials, and no rigorous regulatory framework to demand evidence before release. Pharmaceutical companies, motivated by profit and the promise of a revolutionary new sedative, submitted their own reports, claiming safety and minimal side effects. And in an era when medicine still relied heavily on authority and reputation rather than data, those claims went largely unquestioned. Governments, swayed by the allure of modern chemistry and trusting in the professional integrity of doctors and scientists, approved the drug for widespread use, failing to scrutinize the documentation or demand independent verification. There were no whistleblowers, no formal audits, no mechanisms to test whether the drug could silently harm the unborn. In hospitals and clinics, doctors prescribed thalidomide to women suffering morning sickness, confident in its safety, unaware of the ticking time bomb they carried within. And all the while, the drug acted invisibly, its effects hidden until the children were born, a generation arriving into the world with bodies unfinished, limbs truncated, hearts malformed, eyes and ears misshapen, a tragedy that could have been prevented with even the most basic regulatory vigilance. This was a time when medicine was still a trust-based system, where confidence often replaced evidence, where the authority of doctors and pharmaceutical companies went largely unquestioned, and the result was catastrophic, a grim lesson that the absence of oversight can turn tools of healing into instruments of unimaginable harm.
Francis Oldham Kelsey's vigilance was a rare beacon of reason in an otherwise complacent medical landscape. A single individual whose insistence on evidence over authority changed the course of history. When Grunenthal, the German company behind thalidomide, attempted to flood the U.S. market with promises of safety, Kelsey refused to bow to pressure. She demanded rigorous documentation, questioned the gaps in testing, and insisted that proof of fetal safety was not just desirable, but essential. Pharmaceutical representatives bombarded her with persuasion. Government officials were irritated by the delay, and colleagues doubted her caution, calling it obstructionist. Threats of professional repercussions loomed. Whispers of career damage circulated. Yet she stood firm, guided by a principle simple yet revolutionary. No medicine should reach patients without demonstrable safety. Her unwavering stance prevented American doctors from prescribing thalidomide to pregnant women, sparing thousands of children from the silent, insidious damage that had already devastated families across Europe, Australia, and Canada. Without Kelsey, the United States might have faced one of the largest medical catastrophes of the 20th century, a tragedy avoided not by chance, but by the determination, courage, and moral clarity of one conscientious regulator, whose actions remain a testament to the power of science tempered by ethical responsibility. The legal aftermath of the thalidomide disaster was a maze of delays, loopholes, and partial accountability. Families of affected children filed lawsuits across multiple countries, hoping for recognition, justice, and compensation. Courts grappled with unprecedented questions. Who was responsible? The pharmaceutical company, the prescribing doctors, or the regulators who failed to catch the danger sooner? The trials dragged on for years, with evidence contested, expert testimonies conflicting, and corporate defenses invoking every possible legal shield. Compensation packages were eventually awarded, but they were limited, often insufficient to cover lifelong medical care, prosthetics, or the psychological toll borne by both the children and their families. Grunenthal, the very company whose negligence had catalyzed the tragedy, continued to operate, reinventing its products and reputation, facing only minimal penalties and no criminal convictions. There was no real reckoning, no symbolic imprisonment, no public acknowledgement of guilt that could satisfy the moral outrage of a global community. Meanwhile, the survivors grew into adults, carrying not only physical deformities, but also the indelible mark of a society that had trusted authority without scrutiny. Their bodies remained living evidence of a system that valued profit and reputation over human life, haunting reminders of what happens when trust in medicine is misplaced and oversight is absent. The world had witnessed a catastrophe that was preventable, yet accountability proved elusive, leaving lessons painfully clear, but justice painfully incomplete. The thalidomide tragedy rewrote the rules of medicine and pharmacology in ways that continue to shape every prescription, every clinical trial,
and every regulatory decision today. Before thalidomide, drugs were often released based on limited testing, anecdotes, or short-term observations. The unseen effects, especially on the most vulnerable, the unborn, were ignored or unknown. After thousands of children were born with severe deformities, the medical community was forced to confront the horrifying consequences of assumptions and insufficient scrutiny. Multi-phase clinical trials became mandatory, requiring prolonged observation, careful documentation, and rigorous peer review. Drugs intended for pregnant women could no longer be approved without extensive teratogenic studies, and regulators around the world strengthened their powers to demand evidence rather than take company claims at face value. The distinction between ordinary medications and those potentially affecting fetal development became codified, creating layers of legal and scientific protection previously unimaginable. Governments imposed strict monitoring, follow-ups, and post-marketing surveillance, establishing systems designed to catch rare but catastrophic side effects before they could devastate lives. The principle that emerged, safety before profit, evidence before trust, transformed medicine into a science that demands proof rather than reliance on authority. Today, every label warning, every mandatory disclosure, every prenatal medication guideline traces its lineage to thalidomide. Those laws, those trials, that relentless scrutiny exist because a generation of children suffered, because a society learned, often painfully, that even well-meaning medicine can destroy if left unchecked. The tragedy did not merely rewrite policy, it redefined the ethical framework of medicine itself, ensuring that while no system can be perfect, the ghosts of thalidomide serve as a perpetual reminder of the cost of oversight's absence.
The eerie paradox of thalidomide is that the very compound which once carved deformity into thousands of innocent bodies did not vanish into obscurity. Instead, decades later, science found that it held therapeutic potential for certain cancers and immune disorders, demonstrating the dual-edged nature of chemistry and medicine. Yet this return was nothing like the careless, untested distribution of the 1950s. This time, layers of regulation, oversight, and ethical scrutiny surrounded its use. Pregnant women were absolutely forbidden from taking it. Teratogenic risks were prominently labeled, and the drug could only be administered under tightly controlled conditions with constant monitoring and documentation. The same molecule that once wrought hidden devastation now carried the hope of healing, but the shadow of its past loomed over every dose, every prescription, every consent form. It stands as a chilling lesson that medicine is never purely neutral, that even compounds with potential for good can harbor profound danger, and that history must guide science as much as discovery inspires it. The legacy of thalidomide is thus both cautionary and transformative, a stark reminder that the lives of the most vulnerable demand vigilance, that trust without proof can be lethal, and that progress in medicine is inseparable from ethical responsibility. It is a story that merges tragedy, accountability, and redemption, illustrating that even in the darkest chapters of medical history, lessons can be learned, policies can change, and lives can be protected, but only if memory endures, only if the mistakes of yesterday inform the science of today.